So as we get started, you'll see that this webinar is co-presented by myself and Catherine Newington from the Australian Computer Society. Catherine and I decided not to dedicate slides to our own bios, but you can read about us in the event description that you got with the booking and the emails. We were just going to get cracking and see how far we get through. Here we go.
Now, before we do start, we'll just go, the instructions at the very top tell you to go to menti.com and then type in the code 906944. There is a little bit of an interactive part of this webinar, and we'd really like you to be part of it. All the answers are completely anonymous, and they aren't related to your login or your registrations as well. It's just a little bit of fun that we're going to have this afternoon.
So here's our schedule for today. We're going to kick off with a bit, and if you've been to one of our previous webinars, this will be a bit familiar to you, but we're going to kick off with a little intro to the Digitech curriculum, because it might be new to some people, or some people haven't. It's been a while since you've had a look at the scope and sequence, so we're going to have a brief look at that. We're then going to start looking at stories and procedural text, particularly as used in the lower primary and middle primary sort of setting. We're then going to get into interactive fiction and a little bit of discussion what it is and tools that you can use for it. And then towards the end, we've got a couple of other examples, stop motion, and also looking at AR and VR tools. So kind of towards the end, we'll be looking at more at those more out there tools for ways that you can do immersion and interactivity. We always start with this because this can be a source of confusion among teachers in schools. What is digital technologies as a learning area? And it's not just ICT. When we talk about ICT, we're usually referring to the general capability that we find in the Australian curriculum. It's about using technology in your other classes and in your everyday life, using it safely, using it effectively. It might be things like using Office tools correctly to write your reports, or it might be something like making a movie on your iPad, or things like that. Those are uses of ICT. In Victoria, those things are all explicitly integrated into learning areas. So you'll see in the maths curriculum, use maths, use ICT to do da, 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 da. Or in science, use ICT to do this and that. Whereas digital technologies is a specific learning area for F to 10. It has specific thinking skills, design thinking, computational thinking, and systems thinking. And it's much more about under the hood of the car. So rather than driving the car, it's more about what's under the hood, what sort of things can students create in terms of coding and data, and there's a little bit of theory in it as well. It's effectively a computer science curriculum that goes through all the year levels. If you're interested in this difference between Digitech versus ICT, because ideally your ICT skills, your general capabilities are being taught in all the different classes in your school, there's a few different resources that we've linked here and also in the resources doc. So the VCAR have a couple of posters there, one for primary, one for secondary. There's also one with the Australian curriculum that's up at the Digital Technologies Hub there. And then the Australian Computing Academy have these great little cards, and they're great for a staff room afternoon, maybe just play a little game where everyone has to figure out which of the skills belong in the Digitech curriculum and which are just ICT capabilities. When it comes to the Australian versus the Victorian curriculum, the good thing about the Victorian curriculum, and we are going to be using the Victorian curriculum today, the good thing about it is that it is very similar to the Australian curriculum. The content descriptors are almost identical. There's a difference in structure. The Victorian ones are structured a little differently. They're put under topical strands. But otherwise, it's easy to map the content descriptors across from Australia to Victoria. So we're going to just dip our toes in for a moment, and we're going to just have a quick look at the scope and sequence for the Victorian curriculum. This won't take long, but we thought it'd be useful just so that you can get a glimpse at it if you haven't looked at it recently. So I'm just going to take over the screen for a moment and we'll bring up that link there. All right, here we go. So that link takes you to this view. This is from the VCAR's Victorian curriculum page, and it's filtered, so it's only showing the content descriptions. It's not showing the other bits. And you can see that the curriculum, we've got F to 2, 3 to 4, and we go from left to right, and we continue across to the right to 9 and 10. What we thought we'd do is just look at one of the content descriptors today, or a pair of them, and see how they kind of grow or sort of evolve as we go from F to 2 up into secondary. So Catherine, I think you were going to pick one of these to start off with.
Yeah. So one thing that I've really liked about the Victorian curriculum and also the Australian curriculum is how it is mapped out as a continuum. And it means that especially in that primary school year level, that when you're moving around to different year levels, you can take that knowledge of what you've already done in one particular year level and move it up and bring it with you, or move it back down again. So gone are the days where we almost have to have completely different content that we have to teach our students. And so what I want to show you now is that creating digital solutions, you can see in the foundation to year 2, that they're all about following and describing a sequence of steps. So it's just, and then in order to solve a problem. Then as we move up a little bit, they start to then define that simple problem and describe and follow the sequence of steps. Now we're starting to get a little bit more complex, but now we're bringing in branching and user input. So branching is something when you've got two options. So you might open up box A and box B, and obviously there's two different things in them. And then the user input is something that the user might say, and then they'll choose the difference between, are you going to pick box A or will you pick box B? Then we move up to grade 5, 6. We're still defining those problems. Excuse me. And then what you will find now is that we've still got that branching for they learn in 3, 4, but now they're also now going into iteration, which is another word for repeating as well. And you can also see there that it starts to involve it and create the in structured English as well. So you can see that they might then start to bring in flowcharts as well.
Now, if I come across to the 7, 8, and 9 and 10, we can see it's 7, 8, and 9 and 10. Again, more formalized, a bit more detail, a bit more complexity. So the relevant one here is designing our algorithms and developing them. So designing algorithms, we represent them diagrammatically with flowcharts and in English, maybe with pseudocode or a plan. We trace the algorithms, and then we start to involve a user interface, branching, iteration. We bring in functions. And a key thing in the secondary is we start using a general purpose language. So we transition from a visual blocky language to a text-based general purpose language like Python or JavaScript. And then finally at year 9 and 10, we get a little bit more sophisticated again. We start talking about modular programs and more complex data structures. So we didn't want to, obviously we could spend a whole day or more just going through all the content descriptors, but we just wanted to show you how it tends to flow from left to right, and a lot of them are the same theme, but they just sort of gather complexity as they go along. So we'll come back to the slideshow now.
Oh, okay. So this is now we're going to be using Menti, and we're going to be looking at how you might be creating choose your own adventure stories. So go to menti.com if you haven't already and use the code 906944, because the question is that you're walking out along a path in the forest. 2 items are glistening in the sun. You find an axe and a key. Which do you take? Oh, we've got 50-50 so far.
So when you go to that Menti and then put in the code, you should be presented with the question so that you can select an option.
And it should automatically refresh, but it hasn't. Oh, we're still. Oh, more people are picking up the axe. Oh, no, they're not. No, more people are picking up the key.
I think the key's in the lead.
Oh, the key's definitely in the lead.
We'll just give you guys a couple more seconds on this, and then we'll proceed.
Going. Thank you for also participating in this as well. All right, we'll keep going. Now, obviously, when we would normally want to do something like this, that we would then have the other slider that majority would be taken to the key rather than the axe. And so, but it's a little bit harder when you are doing it as a webinar. So for the first one.
Sorry, I've noticed somebody took over presentation there, Shanjida. I might get you to take it back, Catherine, so that it's...
Oh, yep, sure. Okay, resume.
There we go.
Oh, beautiful. So what we now have then is, depending how we would normally like this to be running, is that whichever one you would pick, the key or the axe, that would then take you down to a different path. So you've now just experienced user input by deciding which one you would take, and then we would branch off to either side. A little bit difficult to do that as a webinar. So the first one is that if you did pick the axe, then this one is, you come across a small house and hear all the better to eat you with. You find a wolf dressed as a granny about to eat her. What do? You can either A, use the axe to kill the wolf, or run away. 2020 has been too much to deal with this year. I agree. Yeah, 2020 has been a hard year already, hasn't it?
Gosh, we've got a lot of people picking that one.
I run away as well. So I did kind of have an idea in my mind that I was thinking about some, obviously, fairy tales and things like that. And so that was my motivation behind these ones as well. Now, oh, sorry, that was, some people were still doing that. Now, this one is, if you found the key. You found a house in the woods and it smells so sweet. You hear a whimper and look through a window. Two children are locked up. What do? Do you use the key to unlock the children? 2 more children in my class won't make a big difference. Or, sorry, what? Got distracted by wine. Oh, lots more people are saving the children this time.
That's good to know.
We're still nice.
We're still teachers.
We're still teachers at heart, aren't we?
So what we obviously, you know, this might look a little familiar to you, and this idea of a choose your own adventure is going to come up a few times in the webinar this afternoon. But obviously, you don't normally do it by a vote. Normally, the user or the person playing the book or playing the game gets to choose.
Yeah, we just wanted to use it as an idea just to kind of get the momentum coming in and introduce it in a way, and also get you involved with the journey as well, because that's a whole idea between choose your own adventure. I think most of us have gone. All right, there we go. So now we're going to be talking about how we can integrate that digital technologies curriculum and some of those content descriptions, especially algorithms, into stories and procedural text. So coming from a primary school background, I found this to be using stories as a part to be able to teach something. And I always use the stimulus in mathematics. So if you've ever used, you know, storybooks and non-fiction texts in a mathematics setting, then use that idea and bring it into the digital technology setting as well. If you are starting out in this journey and you're still a little bit kind of finding your feet with algorithms, then procedural text is a really great way to start that off and start that language, especially with yourself and your students too. So I've created a couple of examples how you can grab the stories and what there might be in them, and how you can transfer and mix that around to help you if you are teaching any literacy. Coming from a primary school background, I kind of put myself back into it and thought that it's really great when you're doing that the first literacy hour that you've got, and then you might be having that shared experience with your children and having that whole class activity. So that's kind of what I put myself into. And then some of these activities could then be presented during any rotations or any small group activities that you have as well. So a blank hundreds grid for me was always something that I used all the time. And being the old laminating queen at my old school, it was something that I always had, you know, just always printed off millions of them and just had them ready for the students to use. So a way that you could start putting in the algorithm side is that the first little dot point and example is using the 3 little pigs. And what the students can do is they can then draw where the houses might go, and then draw draw a path with arrows, marking out the path the wolf might take to each of those houses. You could make it a little bit more complicated as well, that they might need to go and do something and move around and go back to somewhere else. And so it really is where you see your students and their ability, and how you might present that to the class as well. Another great idea is looking at Hansel and Gretel. And so they moved from their home through the forest, and then they got to the witch's house. So what might they see on their journey to their witch's house? If you're starting to dabble in robotics, and you might have pharaohs or you might have bebots in the younger year levels, then what they can do is transfer all of those, the grids that they've created by drawing, and then transfer that information into the robot to test out their path to see if it works. What you can also do, if you don't have the robotics and you wanted to test it out, get the students to write out all of the instructions, and it can easily be as up to turn left, turn right. And what I ended up having was, if there was any ones that needed any spelling assistance, then I just had those keywords written on the board, so they had them there for them. The next one as well is, so I've had to think about fairy tales, so they've been on my mind. And one of the things that I was thinking of is, how could we incorporate the digital technologies curriculum into, say, something like a fairy tales unit? So my past experience of being a teacher in 3, 4 and in the foundation to 2 level is that there's always a really rich unit of fairy tales, and I wanted to then bring in the digital technologies curriculum into common fairy tales that we might teach. And so thinking about those ones in a digital solution is, if you're teaching the gingerbread man and that story, what could you, at the very end of that story, we see that the gingerbread man gets to the river and obviously is eaten up by the wolf beforehand. And so instead of that, what we might be able to do is recreate an ending and ask our students, what could you create that would get the gingerbread across the river without being eaten by the wolf? Get them to think about any type of really cool hardware or software that they could add with that as well. Putting that same idea onto the story of Rapunzel. So instead of the prince climbing up to the hair and using the hair to climb up to save the princess, what could a digital solution do, and how could he use that to get up to the tower? And when I was thinking about this, the first thing that I thought of was like a cherry picker. So we could use that, but what other technologies could we use to help save Rapunzel? That would be very interesting. And something as simple as getting the students just to draw it on a piece of paper and start to explain what hardware and software they're using as well. So that would then mark against the very first content description, which is you looking at hardware and software for a purpose. Then the next one we have as well, if there's any data collection. So if you're, again, so fairy tales are great for something like this. If you've got Beauty and the Beast, you'll notice that there's a lot of human and non-human characters within that. And what they could do is start to create a graph at the start of the book and count the difference between the human and non-human characters, and then to have that by the end of it. And they can see slowly the transition between, was there a point in the book where there's more human characters? Is there points in the book where there's less human characters? And it really has a really great way to discuss the data. Another thing is, if you are starting off a unit of work on fairy tales, is that you could actually start and collect data right from the very beginning and go through every single fairy tale and look at how many animals there are versus how many humans there are as well. And yeah, just another really easy way for you to collect data, but marking against that digital technologies curriculum. Another one is procedural text. So if you are starting out fresh on the Digitech curriculum, it's a really great way to look at how you've already been teaching procedural text and maybe just tweak what you're already doing. So this one here is a recipe on how butter is made. So all I did was I kind of grabbed bits and pieces off the internet and found that information and just presented it as a flowchart for the students as well. I would then, if I was to use this in the classroom, I would make this quite big as a poster, and this would then become one of my pieces of literacy that I would use over a couple of days. I would talk about the formatting of it, how there's arrows between each of the steps, how there's some pictures as well. And even you could then use an activity like this is in a small group activity is cut up the pieces and get them to put it back together again, and then talk about the importance of actually sequencing the correct steps at the correct time. The next one that I have is a 3-4 one, and this is when you're looking at instructions as well. And we all know how to make a chatterbox. Well, what I've done here, and I've thought about something that students already know how to use as well. And so I've put those instructions that when we use a chatterbox into as a flowchart. And to get the students then understanding the difference between branching and user input is that I've color coded the boxes for you as well. So you can see right at the start, we always have it closed. And the first thing we always get them to do is either pick a color, which is out on. That's user experience because we always have someone pointing, and then that will then depend on what's going to happen next. After we've then spelt out the word, we then are given with, it'll either be open vertically or horizontally. That's branching because we'll either go one way or another way. And then we get the user to pick another number to go through it as well. So you can see it's a great way to put instructions into a flowchart to get them thinking about them and getting to think about how can we organize the information so it's easily available to us. And when we do look at a flowchart to begin with, sometimes it can be quite overwhelming. But if we start to break down the steps, we actually just look at it and go, it's something that they already know as well. The next one that I have as well is something going back to a grade 5-6 class now, and then we're looking at making ice cream. So again, something that's happening already in the classroom that you are doing procedural text. So we start right up at the very top, and I've kind of, the blue circles are looking at a little bit of iteration, but also branching out as well. So you can see the very first, you may not be able to read it right now, but it says, have you got all your equipment ready? If you go yes, then you'll continue with the recipe. If it says no, you go back and you repeat, and then you get the equipment that you need and you repeat that step. So then you go through the whole little process and see once it's actually thickened and, you know, looking at that, not just really following the ingredients and the instruction, but also making sure that they're completing those instructions. So, you know, the next one that we have is, has the sugar dissolved? And so if it's yes, continue on with the recipe. If it's not, repeat this step until the sugar has dissolved. I think one of their favorite ones was, what type of flavor would you add to your ice cream? So they had choc chip or no flavor at all. So of course, that is the most important branching that they had. So this one here, we're going to do, we've got a little quiz now. Oh, we've got lots of people on. I'll just make sure I'm connected as well. We've got 3 little questions. I think we'll wait. There's more people coming on. We've got a couple of questions around how we could create and the type of software that we could create to do some branching and iteration when it comes to storytelling.
If you've come in from before and you weren't here for the first time, the link to go to at the top there is menti.com, and then that code 906944. And
when you do pop that code in, it will take you right to the correct slide that we're on as well. I think my favorite part about Menti is all the different characters that come up.
Yeah, there's a lot.
When I was just,
sort of like emoticons.
I know. The 2 people dancing, I think that's my favorite. I was a taco when I was testing it out. I'm a little bit disappointed I'm not anymore. All right, so
here we go.
We're all good. Yep.
Now, some of these questions are just for fun. The first one, when was the first Choose Your Own Adventure novel published? Now, some of you may not know what that is, so just take a guess if you're not sure, but some of you might remember these if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, or maybe even the 2000s. When do you think the first one was published? So we've got 20 seconds left.
20 seconds, yeah. I was generous today. I gave you a little bit more thinking time than usual.
2, 1. Time's up. Oh,
Oh,
look at that. Quite a lot of people got it right.
yeah.
I hope you didn't Google it. I bet you some people Googled it because we can't tell.
We should have said something like that before. Maybe I was too generous to give you so much time.
All right. What software can be used by students to make interactive fiction? We've got PowerPoint, Scratch, Twine, and all of the above. Just while we're doing this, I realized the link for our resources document only comes up right at the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to paste it into the chat now so that you can actually see the resources document that we keep mentioning that's got the links for today's resources. So I've just pasted that now into the chat. So feel free to access that when you're ready.
All right. How did we go for this one? Ooh. Oh,
yeah, all of the above. And we'll be talking about each of those tools today.
And our last question.
What does AR stand for? Is it artificial reality, abstract reality, augmented reality, artistic reality? Oh, that was a quick one.
Oh, that was a quick one. Sorry. Mustn't have put the time on that one. Oh, everyone was quick. First fingers.
Look, that one must have been too easy, I think.
Yeah, yes.
All right. Now, interactive fiction. This is an area where I feel that it's a great connection point between English and literacy and Digitech, because not only can you bring in some creativity here, but you're also doing algorithms. You're looking at how decisions are made and how you can loop back and all those sorts of things that are part of algorithm design. But at the same time too, interactive fiction has a lot of benefits just in itself. And one of those that people sometimes talk about is the way that it brings agency to the reader or to the player. You sort of feel like you're part of the story, and that can help with the sort of immersion in the story. In the resources doc, there's links to a few resources to do with games, and it's becoming more known now that games have a lot of benefits. Video games, that is, have changed a lot since maybe when I was a little kid, when it was sort of, we need to rescue the princess from the tower kind of storyline, to much more complex and deep storylines with a lot of concepts and a lot of things in them. They're now made a lot like movies are made, with huge budgets and professional writers who do the story and stuff. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you can find in that world. So we're just going to be talking about some of the tools that students can use for interactive fiction in upper primary and secondary. So the classic project that you're probably aware of is PowerPoint. And what you tend to do with PowerPoint is you make up your slides and you put links within the slides, which we'll call navigation links. And these are links that, instead of taking you off to Google or somewhere else, they just link you, they take you to another slide in the same slideshow. And by doing this, you can have a slideshow that takes you from place to place, and you can basically create a choose your own adventure story. If you were doing a project like this with the students, it might be a good idea to pre-plan it first, but you can have slides with 2 or more choices. You can have some slides, maybe there's no choice on that slide, or maybe it's one of the endings. You can have good endings and bad endings. You can also bring in images, sound, video, things like that. On the next slide, I've got a little picture of a template that you could use to help the students plan first. Those of you who've ever done PowerPoint projects and things with students will know that some students will spend hours and hours and hours messing around with getting just the right word art or just the right picture, or trying to find pictures that fit. By getting them to do a bit of a plan first and getting them to do their writing first, you can sort of hopefully reduce the amount of time wasted on things like that. This plan, the idea is that they can write in briefly into the little slides. It's an A3 size. They write in briefly what what's going to happen on that slide, and then they can have arrows to point to where it goes, where the choices go to another slide in the circle there. These are some examples of little story starters that you might use to try and get kids going. It's always best, obviously, if students come up with their own stories, but you know, there's some little ideas there. But students could also, when I did this with some Year 7s once, the students came up with you know, murder mystery games. So they kind of went a bit further with the concept. At the end, you had to figure out who was the murderer. I've seen ones where students did like a really random sort of story about an exploding cake. So there's all sorts of things that students can do with these stories. Of course, PowerPoint's not the only option for this. You can also do it with Google Slides, of course. It also allows you to create navigation links. There's a little sort of unfinished example there that could be a starting point, Robbie Robot. Google Docs and Microsoft Word, because you can create links to headings within those documents, and you could even link to other documents. And then there's Google Sites and other web page tools. But of course, when using tools like that, you do have to be careful about your school's privacy and you know, security policies. I'd also like to introduce you to a different approach that brings in a little bit more computational thinking. Most of you have probably heard of Scratch. You may not have heard of Scratch. It's a very well-known visual coding environment that's used in a lot of schools. It is suited to, I guess, middle, upper primary, sometimes lower secondary, as you're sort of doing that transition towards general purpose programming. By adding code to our stories, we can encourage more computational thinking while still being able to keep some creativity there. So I'm just going to once again take over and show you that link, the bit.ly link down the bottom there, and show you the story as a little example. So I'll just take that over now. Oh, and yes, Scratch Junior for the younger kids. All right, so I'm just taking over here. Okay. So you should be seeing, this is a Scratch project that I just put together as a little demonstration. I'm going to make the little gameplay area full screen, and we're going to start the game. So you can see the station shelves are stacked high with books and ornaments. Press A to exit. So we can use A. And now we're out in the Antarctic. Stepping out of the meteorological station, you feel the chill of the Antarctic wind. And we've got an option A to walk inland or B to return to the station. So we're going to keep walking inland. I'll press A. And now we've got a cave. I'm going to press A again to enter the cave. And you'll see it's too dark to see anything. Press A to go back outside. So it looks like we're stuck. But if you remember back at the cabin, there was a torch. So if we're going to hit B and B again, it takes us back in here. There's my torch. So I'm going to click on that. Now I've got the torch. And if I return to the cave, A, now something different happens, and that's the end of the story. It's a pretty short story. Now, the code inside this, if I click see inside just to see the code, now this may look a little overwhelming at first because it is a completed project and there's quite a bit of code going on. But just to show you the backdrops, basically each of these scenes is one of 5 backdrops, and you can see all 5 of the places we went to as I go through them there. And the great thing about the latest version of Scratch, Scratch 3, is that the text that you put in is not baked into the background. You can still edit it. So I can still change that text if I want. And that way I can continue to edit my story and improve my story as I go along, rather than it being fixed into the background. If I show you a little bit of the code here, one of the key parts to the code has to do with this decision here. So when we press A, one of the things it checks is if we're at the cave entrance, then it checks, do we have the torch? If we have the torch, it will do something else. But if we do not have the torch, we go to the dark cave. But if we have the torch, we go to the garden. So you can see that we've made some conditionals here. We've made some branching statements, a bit of structure there to bring in a little bit more complexity to the code. Now, from the player's point of view, the big difference between this, I'm just switching back to the presentation now. The big difference between this and just a plain old PowerPoint project is that we're actually able to change the story by collecting items. If you just have a branching story in PowerPoint, there's no way for it to remember what you did before. Whereas by using a variable like that, we've brought in a bit more interesting code. The other one that I wanted to demonstrate is an online platform called Twine. And this might be more interesting, particularly to teachers of English who may be less interested in the fineries of the code and more interested in the students just focusing on the writing. So this website here, I'll take over again in a moment and just show you this website so you can see what Twine is. But it's one of several online tools for doing interactive fiction. So I'll just take over one more time here and show you Twine. Okay, so when you go to twinery.org, this is the website you get. Looks like this. You can download the software, but you can also use it online. To save your work, you would obviously have to create an account so that you can continue saving your work. And I'm just going to go plus story to start a story. And we're going to do the 3 bears with Goldilocks. And what we get is this nice view where we get the beginning passage. It's got the green circle there to tell us that this is where the game will start. And this is my first passage, or my first room in the story. So I'm going to double click here. I'm going to give it a name, Outside the House. And I'm going to say Goldilocks stands outside the 3 bears' house. Go inside is going to be one option, or go home and be safe is the other option. Now, if I close that one now, you'll see that it has automatically created 2 branching points to the story. So straight away, we've got those and we can edit those points. So I can go into this one and I can say, we go home and be safe. And this is going to be an ending. So Goldilocks goes home and never goes to the house again. Easy. The other one, he goes inside, we could continue the story. Should we, there are 3 bowls of porridge. And we could have, take the big one. Now you notice I'm doing these double brackets. This is how we do our choices. Take the small one, and so on. And once again, you'll see that creates another 2 branches. And this is how we put our story together. Now, obviously, there's a lot more complexity you can do. You can have things branching back. You can change the names of the links. You can add variables as well. But I'm just going to do a quick demo of this, playing it, to see how it looks when you actually play it on your screen. So this is how it looks when you actually turn it on and play it. You've just got the pure text there. Choose go inside or go home and be safe. So I'm going to choose go inside. And we get to the next decision. There are 3 bowls of porridge. I could go back and I could say, go home and be safe. Goldilocks goes home and never goes to the house again. So that's a very quick demonstration of Twine. And I think that will probably take us back to the presentation there, Catherine. But just a quick little demo, just to show you what's possible. But what I do like about Twine is how it just lets you focus on the writing. There's not an awful lot of distractions, but later on, if you want to, you can add images, you can add other things. You can even add JavaScript code to improve and make things more interesting. I'm not going to demonstrate this one, but Quest is another platform similar to Twine, but it allows you to do other kinds of text adventures too. So the kind of text adventure that you might have seen in the 80s and 90s, where it's go north, go west, go south, you know, fight the troll, those sorts of text adventures as well. So that's an alternative. You might be asking, if you're a secondary, what about Python or JavaScript? Because those are sort of our 2 popular languages for secondary students. And yes, you can absolutely do these sorts of simple interactive stories with Python or JavaScript. For the simple type of ones, you might just want to use if and then branches in your code. But if you wanted to do more complex ones, then you might be developing an engine or developing something a bit more advanced to run your adventure game. One last little demo. This one is to show how we now have natural language processing and AI to recognize people's speech. And there are now tools you can use to make programs that have speech recognition as part of it. And one of those tools is a website called Pencil Code, which allows you to do JavaScript, as well as another language called CoffeeScript. And this is the last demo I'm going to give, but this is a great little, it's surprisingly simple in terms of the code you have to do to make it work. So let's just quickly go to that one now. And here's the code. Basically, I've got, you start here, you stand at a fork in the road, it listens to what you say, and then it takes you to one of the options. So I'm just going to run this program, and hopefully my microphone will work with it. Let's give it a shot.
You stand at a fork in the road. Go left or right?
Go left.
You see a spooky house. Go back or go inside?
Go inside.
Oh, well, I can't hear her.
Oh, you're not hearing her.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So what's actually happening is that the computer is also talking and saying, you know, you see a spooky house, go inside or go back. If you want to follow that link yourself and have a little go at it, please feel free. It should work, especially it'll work once you finish this webinar, because your microphone may be occupied for the webinar. If you're interested in graphical adventures, so sort of old school adventures where you walk around and talk to people and collect objects, but you can also see graphics on the screen. One option for that is a classic program called Adventure Game Studio. It's been around for a long time. It does require installation and it's Windows only, but it's definitely worth a look at as an option as well. And finally, there's a little tool that someone told me about recently called Pitseat, and it's all about minimalist sort of retro style games. You can use that to do kind of very basic little things. But the cool thing is that there's some really good examples out there, people that have done like sort of very poetic stuff with it and sort of small prose. So I've given a couple of links to a couple of examples of that in our resources document, and it's definitely worth having a look at. A lot of these, we're reducing the amount of real coding that needs to be done, but we're still doing algorithm design. With the, I've just noticed, Martin, the link there to Voice Story, it does work if you use a capital S for story. It's if you do Voice Story with lowercase s, it'll take you to something else. With the use of any of these platforms, just be aware that people who make independent games, often they do have adult themes. So issues such as mental health and violence and so on. So just be aware of that and be careful about the examples that you provide to your students. Okay, we've got one more quiz here. I'll let you do it, Catherine.
Oh, no, that's all right. One more. We've got one more quiz to go. So I want you to think about how is the digital technologies curriculum and the learning area taught at your school? So if it is multiple ways, then you can certainly put in a couple of other options as well. So it's not taught explicitly. The next one along is that the homeroom teachers, as in the classroom teacher, is responsible for doing it. There's a specialist timetable. There's also then the specialist timetable within primary school or secondary, or it's integrated in their STEM program. So if you haven't gone on, you can go on to menti.com and then just pop in the code 906944 to be part of this little presentation, this interactive part. Seems to be a lot of homeroom teachers in the primary school that are to do it. And so hopefully then this gives you an opportunity in some of the ways that I've shown you how you can incorporate, say, that English and the literacy that you're already doing and put in the digital technologies. So look at your English curriculum and what you're doing with a lens of digital technology. It will certainly help you. And then if you're a specialist teacher at a primary school, you might be able to then have a term on how you can create interactive stories, but focus more on the digital technologies curriculum. Thinking as well that if you are using a tool, say like Google Docs or Microsoft, that does have that online collaboration part to it, you may not be teaching the actual visual programming part of the curriculum, but you certainly can assess against the online collaboration part of it. So it seems to be more homeroom. Yeah, the primary school and some specialist secondary as well. And again, if it is that secondary, could you have a whole term doing something like this with more of a focus on the digital technologies?
All right, just the last part of today, we wanted to look at some other types of tools, particularly heading in the direction of multimedia and other things for pushing the boundaries and other sort of projects that you can do. So we'll be talking about stop motion, AR and VR, and tools that you can use for that.
So this was activity that I did a couple of years ago when we were just starting to look at the digital technologies curriculum. And this use of stop motion happened because we had a professional development that was all around literacy, and we'd gone from teaching and having those literacy group activities on a weekly basis to incorporating the concept of an author study into a fortnightly rotation. I loved that idea and certainly embraced that idea. And what it meant is that for 1 week, we would focus on one author, have a couple of books, not necessarily one per day, and we will then create activities that were around that text. The first book that we ended up, and the first author that we chose was Pat Hutchins. And the first book that we happened to read was Titch. Now, if you're not familiar with Titch, he's the youngest of a family of 5, and it's all about his little adventures that he goes on. And so what I found out was that this series in this book was actually turned into a claymation series. So you can imagine how crazy my students went when they found out that, you know, they could watch Titch and see him almost in a real life version. I wanted to then start to explore that same concept with my students and look at how a written text has been transformed using technology. It was more of the ICT capability, but I'll show you how I did integrate parts of the digital technologies curriculum into it. We didn't do the claymation side of it because I thought for a grade 1 and 2 classroom, that would just be way too difficult for them. And I wanted it to be short, sharp, and simple. So the very first activity that we did is for a whole week, we looked at Titch and they got to make a stop motion of them playing with Titch. So all I had to give them was an A3 white piece of paper, and they drew a background. I gave them a little mini Titch that they then cut out, and then they put themselves and Titch on the piece of paper, and they made a little stop motion story. The whole idea of that particular activity was to skill them up with using technology. So this came from a one-to-one iPad school, but if you share iPads or something similar like that in the junior years, you can certainly adapt this activity to that. So the very first one is that we ended up having Titch go and play in the garden, and then we also had him playing football and wrestling with some of the top wrestlers as well. And we also had Titch in a maze, and it was great to be able then to explore that. The kids absolutely loved it and were engaged with that part of it. But what I also focused on and made sure before I started the big activity was looking at how they were using the technology and making sure that when they were creating the stop motion, that they gave themselves enough time in between moving the little shapes along the piece of paper. It just meant then that we understood how to take a photo, how the technology worked, and what they could improve on the next time that they were going to create their next stop motion. So while they were doing this project, we were then obviously as teachers thinking forward about how we could continue this, because they just engaged and they just loved it so much. So what we ended up doing was we ended up moving a little bit of what we had planned and changed it a little bit around. So we used the Rosie's Walk, which if you're not familiar with that book, it is a very simplified text, but it's about a minimum amount of words, but tells the story through pictures. So again, we were able to bring in a completely different way of teaching and talking about the value of pictures in storybooks, because I had a lot of my students that thought that, you know, picture storybooks were too baby for them and they were all about chapter books. And I wanted to bring them back to enjoy picture storybooks, regardless of what their level reading was. But what we ended up doing was taking Rosie's Walk and doing 2 things with it. And the first one was we wanted them, the focus of the term was narrative writing, but we wanted them to create quality narratives. And what we started to do was guide them through that, not just using the basic text that Rosie's Walk had, but to further develop their own quality of writing for narrative. So that was a writing activity that we had. Then we also had, the big one is that they then, after they had written their narrative, we got them then to transfer that narrative into a stop motion video. And it was so much fun. It really, as a teacher for me, it was a point in my teaching that I let go of the teaching, and I also got the students to start exploring ways and making that connection between stories that are written, then also looking at the pictures, but then also bringing in technology into it as well. What we found is that instead of the original idea, which was just to write a story, we were going to then assess against the English curriculum. But what we started to then dabble in is looking at how the digital technologies curriculum had impacted that the story as well. And so we were actually able then to assess on the hardware and software used for a purpose, because we started looking at cameras as the hardware and why we needed the camera, and also the software that we had on the iPad, which is the stop motion app, and then how the camera and the app work together. If I was to do this project again, what I would then incorporate next time is algorithms. So when we did the planning side of the writing, we didn't really focus on a structure to create algorithms, but I'm sure next time we could certainly put in almost a bit of a storyboard / sequence of steps to guide them through of what their story looked like and what background they needed, and also what other characters that they wanted to create as well. Going back that they had already made the background for Titch, we used that same idea, but then they could use as many backgrounds as they wanted to as well. Then we also had that critical and creative thinking came into it, because it was about how they were going to have their writing and turn it into a digital piece as well. The personal and social capabilities all of a sudden came into it as well, because if you are aware that when you make a stop motion, someone needs to hold the camera and take the photo, and the other person needs to hold and move the animals around. And automatically, without even explicit teaching from us, we actually found that the students started to work together. And they almost kind of made these teams together, that the person who owned the stop motion, they were the one who had to control it, and the person who was helping them was taking the photo. And you could see all of a sudden that they were working cooperatively together, because they created their own language of when they were going to, take the photo as well. And just that working together turned out to, again, another area of the curriculum that we could also assess. At that time, it happened to be that we were also teaching science, and we were diving into the light and sound. So again, after they made their stop motion, I taught the students how to take their stop motion from the app and put it into iMovie. Then once it was in iMovie, they started then to play around with sounds, and they even started to create their own sound effects at one stage. So you can see on the photo that I've got here, it's actually an example of what it looked like at the end. And Rosie at one stage goes through an orchard, and one of the person who owned the video, you can actually hear her munching her apple that she took at recess, and she then wanted to video and record herself. So you hear this crunching of an apple in the background. That's her putting her own spin on it as well.
Unmute myself again, sorry. With AR, if you're not sure what AR is, when we talk about augmented reality, it's kind of superimposing digital objects, often 3D objects, through the phone or the iPad or the tablet into the real world. So things look like they're in the real world, but actually you're just seeing it through your tablet. And this, the power of this obviously is that intersection, that you can have things that kind of come into your real world. And one of the applications of this that schools can do is, for example, to have a treasure hunt where you're using QR codes and the students are going from place to place. And when they get in front of a QR code that's on a wall somewhere, it tells you the next part of the story. Now, I'll talk in a moment about some tools to use for that. Thanks, Catherine. With VR, this is more about immersion. So you're kind of inside the 3D world. And these days, there's now quite a broad range of, dollar spending amounts that you can when it comes to different things. Cardboard headsets, obviously your cheapest option, and you put in there a phone. Standalone headsets get more expensive, and then you've got much more expensive systems that use a computer. I see a question there about no phones allowed. I think Deb might be able to clarify this, but one option that I've been told is to basically have old phones that no longer have SIM cards, or you take the SIM cards out, and then those phones can just be used as old phones for this purpose. They can still go on the school Wi-Fi when it's time to use them. But I would like, yeah, it'd be great if Deb can clarify if that's okay in terms of Victoria's rules there. Thanks, Catherine. This tool for AR is Metaverse. This is a free tool. It's about building AR experiences, and you do it by kind of linking up storyboards together. You connect these components, and you can make things appear in the real world. It's not something I've actually personally used, but there are a lot of schools using it, and there's in the resources document there's a full hour of professional learning for teachers on YouTube for how to use it in a classroom setting. The merge cube you may have heard of. It's actually it's literally a physical object. It's a piece of foam that's in the shape of like a die. It's quite large, and it's got QR codes on it. And you can use that in combination with software like Metaverse to sort of have things appear on the sides or on the inside of the cube. And then lastly, for VR, there's also an option of this one, CoSpaces. I put the asterisk next to paid. There is a free version, but it doesn't get you very far. But what you do here is you build a 3D world, you write code for it. You can use visual code or I think JavaScript, and you can make it interactive that way. And then you can enter that world with your VR headset. So they've got a little example here of a Romeo and Juliet sort of world that's been made. And when you go inside that, you can sort of walk towards or tap on Juliet or Romeo, and they say things, and it tells you a bit about their characters. And lastly, there's also location-based games, so games that use GPS. This software, Tailblazer, is from MIT, and it's basically all about making games based on your GPS location. So you can tell a story as the students run from place to place. With GPS, it should be accurate enough to do within your school, but you could also use it wider than that. And that's actually the end of our formal part of the presentation. We made it just in time.
I was looking at that.
We do welcome any questions that anyone wants to ask at this point in the chat. We'll stick around if you do have other questions. There's that link to the resource doc again, just on your screen now. And we will upload the webinar within 10 days as well. And I'll put in the chat the link to find our recordings. Thanks.
Just before everyone goes, it's Kevin, manager at DLTV. Just like to thank Nathan and Catherine, as usual, for excellent presentation. And don't forget to look at the recording and the resources. And if you have any questions, you can also reach out at our website. Yep, so nice to meet you all. And Narracott, nice to see you.
And yeah, thanks from me also, Catherine, for being part of this one.
Oh, not a problem. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Thanks, Clark.
Oh, it's good to see that there was heaps of work. And hopefully there was a range of resources if you are just starting out that you can use, good old-fashioned pen and paper to start that algorithms off, and then slowly move into, using more technology and, moving from that pen and paper idea to then possibly that, PowerPoint slide. And then if you're ready to do some PowerPoint after they've done that PowerPoint, to then move on to the visual programming side of things in Scratch.
I see Sandra said she uses Lego with stop motion. Yeah, a lot of kids like to use Lego with stop motion. And there's so many examples out there. Some people just do incredible projects that like. Oh,
they're so good. Yeah. I did use some Lego stop motion with my grade 5s and 6s, but I found, just the pen and paper stuff was so easy for foundation. I know the grade 1s and 2s.